Well, welcome to the Trail Through Time. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the Calusa Indians that inhabited this piece of property from 500 BC through 1750 AD. This is one of 50 villages along the southwest Florida coastline that the Calusa actually inhabited. This was a smaller village, probably of 35 to 50 people living in it. Some of them, like Mound Key, which was their headquarters, had as many as 2,000 people living on that mound. Here what we're going to see is the trails and the mound upon which they lived. We'll talk a little bit about who they were as a culture, how their society was set up, and what they did on a daily basis, from their fantastic, highly technical fishing techniques all the way through their war making. So how do we know anything about the Calusa Indians? They had no written language. Where do we get the information that we will be presenting to you today? Well, first and foremost, we get it from an eyewitness account. During the 1500s, a Spanish explorer named Fontaneda was captured by the Calusa Indians at the age of 17 years old, and he lived with them for 17 years. And then after that 17 years, the Calusa allowed him to leave. He returned to Spain and wrote all of his daily encounters into a diary. In that diary, we learn things about their religion. We learn things about how they acted as a social community. We learned how they built things that we would not normally find in an archaeological dig. And speaking of an archaeological dig, during the 1890s, the Smithsonian Institution and the University of Pennsylvania sponsored an archaeological dig on Marco Island. And so during that period of time, during that dig I should say, the 1 acre of land that was uncovered gave us a treasure trove of artifacts. Some of them were masks, several dozen masks, typical to the one I have here on my stick, was uncovered in the muck and peat that had preserved them over the years. Of course, once they were exposed to the air, they started to deteriorate quickly. Luckily, the expedition had brought along a photographer and a watercolorist to instantly document what they had uncovered. And to this day, we've got very good color plates, and in some cases, some actual masks that did survive and were preserved. Of course, at that dig was the famous Marco cat, and it was a cypress carved cat, probably that imitated a Florida panther that was uncovered. And most of these artifacts are today located within the Smithsonian Institution's archives in Washington, D.C. So we had two sources of information. We had Fontaneda's diaries, and we had the actual artifacts that were dug up on Marco Island in the 1890s to tell us quite a bit about what happened in these communities. They were excellent fishermen. They would use the canals that they would dig themselves to create fish traps. Imagine, if you will, the digging of a canal several hundred feet long, and when the high tide rolled in, at the ends of both ends of the canal, they would drop a curtain net, weighted at the bottom with seashells, and floats at the top made of cypress slabs or maybe gourds to float the top edge and the bottom edge weighed down by the seashells. And then a third net would be employed to drag the length of that canal, thereby pulling or concentrating the fish to one end. And once they got the fish concentrated to the end, they would take the Jamaican dogwood tree, grind the leaves and the bark up into sawdust, and cast that sawdust upon the pool of fish that had been concentrated by the nets. The fish would instantly pass out, float to the surface, and the folks who were collecting the food for the day would come in with their baskets, grab the fish from the floating on the surface, take what they needed, leave what they didn't need, and a few minutes later the oxygen returned to the water, the fish would swim off as far as the nets would allow them to swim off, and so they were captive, and they became the fish for the next day's capture. So they were excellent at these fishing techniques. When they needed a big fish, a shark or a manatee, a whale, they would actually use their boats, and they would create either hooks out of bones to do fishing with hooks and lines, or they might actually use spears with shark's teeth as the hard point. And that's a good point to remember when it comes to the Calusas. They had no hard stones or metals in these areas. The hardest materials that they owned were shark's teeth. Those shark's teeth were their knives, they were their spearheads, their darts were tipped with shark's teeth, and then the next hardest item that they had available to them was seashells. And of course seashells were only good for digging in the dirt or using as what we would call kitchen utensils, bowls, cups, and they would drink out of them and eat out of them. And of course if the shell was large enough, they maybe even cooked in it as a large cauldron. Ceramics were hard for them to come by. They tried making ceramics here and found that the consistency of the sand and the lack of clay in the area made it nearly impossible for them to create a ceramic that could withstand either heat or moisture. And ceramics that don't hold moisture or can't be placed in the fire are pretty well worthless. That's not to say they didn't use ceramics. And when we climb up on the mound, we may be able to actually locate some ceramics up there. So where would they come from? These were a warlike tribe. They were good at fighting. And did I mention earlier that they were taller than everybody else in the area? About 4 inches taller than anybody who lived in the area. That made them, in their looks, formidable. Combine that with the attitude of what you have, I want, and I'm willing to fight for, that made them a formidable enemy. These folks were hired as mercenaries to fight battles for other Indian tribes as far away as North Carolina. Now in that fighting and in that travel, as they moved from here to North Carolina and back, and of course they were a waterborne community, so they took their boats probably as far north as what we call Orlando today, and then had to walk after that. But from here to Orlando was pretty well flooded while they were here, and probably could paddle the whole distance. But in their travels from here to North Carolina and back, they encountered other tribes that had ceramics. And so trade went on. And maybe they were even paid for that battle that they fought in North Carolina in ceramics. That's something they needed here, and so we do find ceramics here, and the analysis that has been done so far on this particular mound show that those ceramics go back about 1,000 years. All right, right here we have a gopher tortoise hole, and besides the fact that it's a cute little critter, he also does some things for us that are quite helpful when we're talking about the Calusa Indians. As you can imagine, as he digs downward, he's digging deeper into the pile or lower into the pile. Now, if you will imagine that this village was occupied, let's just say till 1700. That means the latter part of the latter part of their time on this mound was taken up with spreading the shells from their meals on the top of the pile. The tortoise digs downward and in a sense is rolling the calendar backwards, because for every inch downward he digs, he's finding older and older shells from older and older meals. And every now and then what he also kicks up, besides all these oyster shells in front of you, is these pottery shards. So we're doing a little bit of our own archaeology just by coming up and looking at the tortoise shell, the tortoise apron here that's created in front of the gopher tortoise's hole. These pottery shards, some of them are just plain old pieces of ceramic, others have artistic decorations on them, and some of them have a peculiar property. That is, that instead of them being just burnt on the outside because they sat in a fire warming some material up inside the pot, some of them are actually charred inside. Now what could that be all about? Well, as the Calusas traveled from one place to the other, and they traveled extensively on some occasions, they would trade with the Cubans some 135 miles from here. And they would, to get there, tie their canoes together and create catamarans or trimarans to get through the seas from here to Cuba. In doing so, they had to tote with them the food they needed to make the trip, and in some cases they needed to tote with them fire, because let's face it, they didn't have a big lighter or a book of matches with them. So they would take some of these bowls, and those that are charred on the inside more than likely were charred because that is how they transported a bowl of hot embers from one place to the next, so that if they needed to cook their food or they needed to stay warm, they didn't have to go through that arduous task of rubbing two sticks together. Remember, this is a group of people who had no metals and no hard stones, and so there was no such thing as flint and steel fires. It would have been either rubbing sticks together or taking fire from the lightning that had struck the area some time ago. That lightning, that fire that was caused by the lightning, would have been captured, so to speak, in the ceramic bowl and carried with them as they travel from one place to the next. The shells on the mound were accumulated over many years. These were the leftovers of their meals, so to speak, the rubbish, if you will, from their table. In some cases, the shells were so plentiful surrounding the area that they would actually just harvest shells to use as fill and not even bother to eat the material in the shell. This particular mound is predominantly oyster shells because surrounding this particular village, and to this day this is true, surrounding this particular village are vast acres of oyster shells. They would simply pick these shells, never worrying about what size they were, and just throw them into boiling water to make a soup or a stew. The shells would drop to the bottom because of their weight. The water would be infused with the protein of the oyster meat. Sometimes the oyster meat would float to the surface, and they would scoop out of that cauldron, out of that big pot, a seashell full of soup for their meals. They were not fancy eaters. When it came to eating fish, sometimes the minnows were all they needed. They'd throw those into a bowl and pot and boil them. There was no such thing as sitting around and doing all that laborious work of scaling and skinning and filleting. They would simply boil the fish and eat it as a broth. All of you have traveled along our pristine beaches of Southwest Florida and seen those little tiny coquina shells in the surf, just as big as a thumbnail. Those were one of their favorite meals. Folks who were in charge of meals for the day would go down there with their baskets and collect those shells by the millions, throw them into water, and once again just boil them and create a broth. There was nobody ever sitting around with a knife trying to open these shells to create a dinner where we'd slurp these things down like we would today. They would just simply boil them, create that broth, and drink that high protein meal right from their seashell. The actual structure of the mound had significance. The commoners would have lived at this lower level over here to my left. Those would have been the worker bees of the village. These are the folks who would have been split into three groups of people. One would have been the folks who sought the food and prepared the food every day. The next group would have been what we would all call our public works department. They would have made the mounds and the pathways. They would have manipulated and moved the shells around in order to create the village infrastructure, if you will. And the third, of course, would have been the professional or full-time army that they had in camp. Then next to my right is a rise in the mound. That's where the sergeants, supervisors, or managers of the village would have lived. Their huts would have been set up just a few feet higher, and this designation in height was like wearing a band on your arm telling you what your rank was. And then further on still, the king or the queen would have been located up there. Now, kings and queens were determined, some people call them chiefs, but the kings and queens were determined by your family lineage. And villages had either a king or a queen. They were equal opportunity employers, so to speak, in that some villages were in fact led by a queen. When it came to the working class folks of the village, female, male roles did not exist. If you were a female and wanted to be a warrior, you could in fact be a warrior. But the king or queen were designated by their heritage to be in charge. They did nothing in the course of a day except to be waited on. Their children sat next to them on stools and lived a pretty boring life because, again, they were not allowed to do anything. The managers, or those sergeants in the middle, were the workhorses. They're the ones who got everything done. And it was interesting that when we have these 50 villages up and down the coast, spaced about 1.5 miles apart, these 50 villages all were run identically as far as their social and their political structure. The design of the village, the infrastructure, was the same within the 50 villages. The only thing that varied there was bigger villages had more infrastructure, but what was there was always a degree of a certain design. That design looked like the letter C, and that letter C, the rounded part of the letter C, faced the Gulf of Mexico. And it was made, the mound was built up in such a way that as storm waters came through, they would hit the outer edge of that letter C and deflect the storm around the village. And then inside the sea, inside the open end of the sea, that's where the village's keepsakes, the treasures of the village, and quite frankly, the only treasures they really had were their canoes were kept. This was protected, if you will. It was a harbor for their canoes. Their canoes were basically two kinds. One was the single-person canoe made out of gumbo limbo, and then the other was anywhere from 3 to 12-person canoe made out of cypress. The way they would fell their trees, knock their trees down, or cut their trees down, if you will, was pretty simple. Remember, they had no sharp objects here, and so the way they got a tree down was to build a fire around the base of the tree. That ring of fire would eventually eat into the trunk of the tree would fall over. Once the tree fell over, they would simply light a fire on the top of the tree trunk, allow that fire to burn inward, thereby hollowing out the tree and the canoe. And when they got it hollow enough, they would take seashells, scrape out the ash, and then they would buff up that inside by using Spanish moss and get it ready for its first voyage. The Calusa Indians were a formidable tribe when it comes to their population. By 1750, that number had been reduced to about 250 members. Now, most of the members were lost to diseases caught from European diseases that they had no immunities for, chicken pox, smallpox, those kinds of things that these indigenous people had no immunities for. Of course, the Spanish, English, and French who had been visiting the coast also had brought along horses, cattle, and pigs, and so some of those domesticated animals provided diseases that the Indians had no immunities for. So most of the Indians were killed by these diseases. The Indians were quite good at fighting and in battles. In fact, during the 1500s, the Spanish mariners wrote in their journals that every time they encountered the Calusa Indians, that they would lose 6 Spanish soldiers or 6 Spanish fighters for every Indian killed. And when you think about that, that's a very interesting concept, because first of all, Calusa Indians were 4 inches or so bigger than everybody else in the area. The Spanish were quite a bit smaller than everybody in the area. And when the Spanish came off the ships, more than likely they were wearing metal helmets of some kind, metal breastplates, and they were basically armed. They had swords, they had rifles or muskets, they had gunpowder, in other words. The Calusa Indians had sticks, they had bones, they had darts, they had shark's teeth, and that was their weaponry. But yet, this Spanish captain noted that he lost 6 of his people for every 1 Indian killed. So that tells us, number one, that they were great fighters, and number two, that a lot of them didn't fall or die as a result of their encounters with the European explorers. This particular village had 2 mounds. We visited the small mound a bit ago. That was about 15 feet above sea level. The second mound would have been placed right where we're standing now. It would have been 30 feet tall and in the shape of a large letter C. The curvature of that letter C pretty much touching where I'm standing right here. The inside of the C would have been that protected water. It would have protected the smaller mound, which is basically just over those treetops. This particular mound was dug up in the 1940s for its shell content. Someone came along and decided that they needed shells to build roads in the area, and what better way than to mine the shell mound that was already in place. They came in here with some kind of excavator, shovel, and barges, and began digging the mound, which was again 30 feet in height above sea level, until they reached a depth of about 15 feet below sea level. So there was 45 vertical feet of shells that were removed from this area to make roads. Once that shell material was removed, the water rushed in and created what we have here today, Cat's Claw Lagoon. A great place to launch boats, a great place to explore the 10,000 islands, and a great place to remember that the Calusa Indians were a mighty tribe with a mighty village. Okay, the last 250 of the Calusa Indians had a choice to make. Do we stay in a place where we keep losing our ancestors? And let's remember, folks, there was no science in the community at that time to figure out why all those ancestors had been lost. We can look back now and say European diseases. We can look back now and say they lost a few to the battles with the New World explorers. However, these folks who were living in the village more than likely believed that the gods were angry with them and it was time to leave the village. They knew that their ancestors had been numerous, and yet now they were down from 20,000 down to 250. They knew they were losing people left and right over a 50-year period. As I say, they probably blamed the gods for this, and it was time for them to pick up and move. The general school of thought is that they got in their canoes, and because they had been trading with the Cubans and had been friends with the Cubans over many years, they sailed to Cuba just east of Havana and landed there to live their life in peace and quiet. I'm certain that the New World explorers that had been coming into their shores for 250 years, roughly from 1500 to 1750, were a nuisance to them, and that had some bearing on them leaving town also. But the general school of thought is they packed their bags, loaded their canoes, and moved to Cuba where they had friends.